Welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Jesus Kova, and today Troy McLachlan is back. His website is saturndeathguard.com. We have had a couple of interviews recently, and today we will go into the myths of the world, and here especially the ancient myth. So Troy, welcome back.
Judith, great to be back with you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so let's at first take a baby step. Mm-hmm. What is a myth?
Well, a myth is, according to various people, as a definition, it is usually a story relating to origins, creations, or cosmologies of any particular culture that seeks to describe or explain where we came from, what has happened to us in the past. My own take on myths is that they are actually recorded events of actual happenings. And that's where I differ very much. The people like myself who have our own particular theories, we differ very much from the mainstream that has relegated myth almost to the realm of fairy tales and is used to explain, its value is purely as a form of explaining, psychiatric issues, psychodramas, what is behind any given culture and its myths, in terms of how their cultural habits have evolved over time. We, on the other hand, tend to take it a little bit more literally, that the mythic records or the mythic accounts of origins are in fact records of past events, and they have a very physical, in reality nature to them, that needs to be explored and understood in that light, to get a greater understanding of what has been told to us in myths.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I had recently another interview with Dr. Judd Burton, and during that interview he also mentioned that when people say, this is just a story, and he said, would you do that if that person was sitting in front of you? Would you tell them that none of what they wrote down they actually experienced? Don't you think that that is a little bit arrogant? And I thought that was a really good comment on that situation.
It is very much a conceit of the modern mind that we somehow know more than the ancient minds, that we have a very condescending attitude towards what they were writing down, where we dismiss a lot of what they said as fantasy, as a form of fantasy, as a way of trying to explain unexplainable phenomenon in such a way that it appeals to a more primitive mind. This tends to be the attitude, and you will often find in modern academia that they will go so far as to say that a particular commentator, take for example Aristotle, and so on. I've in the past I've got it wrong. I've said Plato, but it's Aristotle who made the erroneous supposition that the gods were planets, were stars in the heavens, and therefore stars were the gods, and so on. Roughly along those lines, he made those comments, and you will find in academia that Aristotle has erred in his appraisal of this, and that comes back down to this dominance of the uniformitarian concept of looking at the world, that what we see today is pretty much what everybody has seen, or how the world has been, the universe, the environment has been for, certainly for the experience of man on this planet, mankind, humankind, but they will tell you that for 4 billion years, roughly, this is how the planet has been. And so when a luminary like Aristotle makes a comment that is so at odds with the skies we see today, and directly tells us that the gods of mythology and so on that make up the Greek pantheon, and as a result the Roman pantheon and so on, were based on stars and planets, and they had certain characteristics that turn out to be exactly those characteristics once we had telescopic ability to see what these planets looked like up close. You know, we have that conceit today. This guy didn't get it right. You know, what could he have been thinking? Doesn't he know that the sky has been the same for the last 4 billion years? That, you know, the planets evolved where they were and so on, that this is the same sort of environment. And, you know, this is a very common revisionist conceit. A lot of people have this, you know, this idea that the modern way of looking at things means that we have a better take on events than people who were much closer, if not concurrent or at the time of the event, witnessing the event. We're telling them, no, that's not what you saw. No. This, you know, I can step out the door and I don't see that, so therefore you didn't see it. You know, and you know, it's this uniformitarianism, this gradual evolution thing that has dominated scientific thinking. George Lyell, the geologist, with his thinking, Darwin, and so on. Everything is slow, gradual, imperceptible change, and so on like that. That the idea of catastrophic change, of cataclysms being the engines of change, and so on. And particularly within the human experience, it's just anathema to them. They cannot conceive. And I think I said this in previous interviews with you. It's the hardest thing for people to accept in my particular writings and the book Saturn Death Cult, the cosmology that I put forward, because it is so at odds with the you know, with the modern ideas of cosmology, uniformitarian ideas. And I think a lot of people, it's actually a step too far for many people to go. Science couldn't have gotten things so wrong that as early as 2,500 years ago, Mars and Venus were not in the orbits that we see them in today. You know, this is almost beyond the pale for most people, certainly in academic circles. And of course, as I say to people, in academic circles, a lot of the time, these people's paycheck is totally dependent on you being wrong. You know, if they were to suddenly find out, if there was incontrovertible facts presented that the skies were different, as you know, 2,500 years ago to 4,000 years ago, a lot of these people would not have the qualifications anymore to justify the job that they're being paid to do on the public's tax, you know, as a result of taxation. And so they have a vested interest in denying that, you know, any alternative that is radically different. They don't have an attitude, oh, this is different, I think I might just go and check this out and you know, get whatever value I can get from it. But that's the world that we live in at the moment, and academia is absolutely unable to shift in its paradigm of thinking. And so the rest of us have to move off into other areas and forget about academia, to put it, just, you know, a sad way of putting it, but that is the way it is.
Yeah, and that was also one of the reasons why Dr. Burton left academia. Because it was, in his view, it was a little bit too small-minded.
There is a growing list of academics. Most of them will wait until retirement. I know in the electric universe, the guys who study the hardcore plasma science and so on, we've got some very, very illustrious people from the realms of plasma physics and so on. Dr. Anthony Peratt is an example of that. These guys were at the top echelons of their field in academia, and they've all but admitted they had to wait, even though they were aware of you know, evidence from their laboratory experiments and so on that fitted in with certain mythological records as an explanation as to what people saw and so on. They had to wait until they retired and got their retirement benefits locked in and things like that before they could even admit to the fact they were entertaining these kinds of ideas. And that is the tragedy of the Western world. you know, I remember reading about in Russia it was under communism. I'm definitely an anti-Bolshevik sort of a person, and so on. I think Russia suffered badly under that, but there are a few things that they got right, which is reflected very much in the you know, the sort of the Russian approach to things. But they had a law that when you conducted a scientific experiment, particularly one that was based on taxpayers' money and so on, it didn't matter if the experiment was a total disaster. You had to publish so that other people could see what you had done, and maybe they could detect where the experiment, you know, in other words, you can get benefit out of failure. That's a given. Failure can teach us as much as success.
Yeah, sure. Mm.
But the Western world, if you fail, you lose your funding.
Yeah.
You know, and so nobody is going to fail. And the person who has power over your funding is the guy above you who is controlling whatever paradigm you're involved in, you're involved in terms of you know, whichever sort of academic theory that you're involved in studying. And if you don't please them, because it goes back to what I was saying, their wage is, you know, the last thing they want is a student to come in and say, this is great, you've taught me well, but now I'm going to show you why you were totally wrong. You know, and everything. They're not going to accept that, because their wage packet is dependent on the next person confirming what they believe. And so you get this dog chasing its tail effect in Western academia. And any disaster in an experiment or a paper or whatever like that is just locked away, never to see the light of day, for fear of losing that funding and such. We see it in the whole climate change stuff, where people will go along with what is now considered to be the acceptable paradigm, just simply to ensure that they have a job.
Hmm. Yeah, but does nobody, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but even I can understand that this approach is, yeah, it puts you in a box and it prohibits progress, real progress.
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely.
Does nobody see that?
Well, you see, this is where, you know, where money's involved. No, they don't. Okay, it's, you know, it comes back to that old saying, the root of all evil is the love of money. Academia is about making money. You know, these days, there was a time in Western society where, you know, if you go back to the Renaissance, the minds like Da Vinci and these sorts of people and such, going up into later times, you know, the German Leibniz with and his sort of relationship with Isaac Newton, the English physicist, and so on. These were what people called men of leisure. You know, they did it as a love, and so on, and they were very much involved in the experimental side of things. And really, that you can say that after Einstein, that idea of the, you know, experimenting for the sake of experiment, just to see what happens, such, has been completely eroded, you know, in the minds of scientists, because of the threat to their wage packet if they get things wrong. And that's where Western, you know, Western academia is failing badly, and doesn't even have to be in the sciences. It's there in the arts. It's there in, you know, all of the different disciplines that you can get at university level. I think one of the most illustrative things between what happened in Russia and what's happened in Western academia is the truth behind the story about during the space program, when $1 million really meant something back in the 60s. The Americans spent, I think, over $1 million developing a ballpoint pen that could write in space, because ballpoint pens are reliant on gravity. In a weightless environment, you can't get the ink. So they spent $1 million doing this, all right, to give astronauts a ballpoint pen that worked in a weightless environment. Do you know what the Russians did? They used pencils.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
And, you know, to the Russian mind, it was insane. But to the American mind, the money involved in developing that pen starts to take a life on its own. And when when tax money becomes there available to people and lobbyists come in, yeah, we can develop a pen, it's going to cost this money. They know they're on a lucrative venture there. There is actually no incentive to go in and say, why don't we use a pencil, instead of this pen? Everybody's on the money make. And that's what's happening in our world of science today, whether it's in publishing, whether it's in academia, whatever it is. Nobody dares get outside of the paradigm because you get cut off from the money spigot.
Fantastic. So what would you say separates myth from fairy tales the most?
Reality. Can it be explained? Can there be a natural explanation? Can you recreate what people saw? Can you explain in such a way that it's empirically definable? You can actually get the data to show this. This is why the electric universe was so fascinating, because in my book Saturn Death Cult, I more or less go into the explanation about how myth has become a byword for fantasy. It's become a byword for fairy tales. People will tell you, if you say something totally off the wall that can't be true, it's a myth. If you report something, that's a myth. So it's become synonymous with that, because the madhouse of mythology is exactly that. If you apply our world and what we see today to what they are writing, it makes no sense whatsoever. So if you look at in particular the Saturnian archetype in mythology, whichever mythology, from Chinese to Syro-Babylonian to Egyptian to Greek to Mesoamerican, if you look at that archetype mythology, it makes no sense in terms of the world that we see today. And so therefore we have to concoct, literally, we have to try and second guess what these people were doing. And for many people, particularly Mesoamerican, the closest that you get to the experience today from what you're sort of reading in their myth is people experimenting with LSD and peyote and so on, these color shapes and distortions of reality and so on. So what happens? People start saying, those guys must have been on drugs, and you've got a train of thought there that tries to explain mythology as drug-induced experiences, opium dreams, pipe dreams, it just comes, this disconnect with, or this dogma is really what I'm trying to point out, of the world being the same as it was today as it was back then, is the basis of looking at myth as a as a fairy tale and such. But it is true that there's even another layer to this that is very difficult for a lot of people to get past. When I say go and study mythology, most people go and pick up a popular book. They'll go and watch a film like Clash of the Titans. They'll go and see what Hollywood has done and so on, along those lines. And so much of that work is actually scholars trying to make sense in terms of what they see today of the myths they have. So they create, human type dramas. They anthropomorphize the gods into human characters, and they misunderstand the application of personality to the gods in the ancient myths, and so they create basically novelized romance stories or action adventure stories out of this. And so quite a lot of people come to myth and think they've read ancient mythology when they read popular new modern accounts and even academic accounts of what the myths say, because the people who are doing the translations are so desperate to prove, for example, that anybody worshipping Ra or Osiris and so on was worshipping the sun. All right, the sun that we see today. And so that gets written into these accounts as if that's what the originals actually said. But the originals of mythology are so bizarre if you don't have a key to understanding what they are reporting. And if you have the key, a key that points to an explanation of natural phenomenon that might have influenced what people saw, their explanation of what their witnessed account is giving you, you can break free of that idea that these people went into a pipe dream or went into a trance or were drunk or this is a distortion over many generations of boogeyman stories and this sort of thing where our poor unfortunate ancestors were so afraid of the dark and lightning and so on that they attributed gods to the sound of a thunderstorm or these kinds of the anthropologist studies that try to find very local natural phenomenon as a explanation for mythology. And you've got to ask then, why is that spread throughout the world on different continents almost exactly the same in terms of its archetypes? You would think if every myth was just the natural experience distorted through the oral traditions over time, you would genuinely think that there would be vastly different stories. Origin myths would not be the same. But in fact, Polynesian origin myths, and Mesoamerican origin myths track very closely with Chinese and European origin myths and Hindu origin myths and so on like that. This makes no sense in terms of a world that was scattered and people were not in contact with each other, as they like to tell us. And there was no chance of what they call the diffusion of its central myth. But it makes sense if every culture saw the same thing happening in the heavens, happening in the skies. So, what is there out there that may explain to us a universal phenomenon witnessed by all different types of peoples, cultures, races, tribes, wherever they are in the world? What kind of natural phenomenon could explain this? And that's why people, often turn to the electric universe, because a lot of the stuff that the electric universe people have shown in laboratories and various other methods of experiments and so on track very much with what we've been told was seen in these myths and such. It's not the be end all. You can't take the electric universe. It doesn't become a hammer and therefore everything becomes a nail to work with and so on like that. There are subtleties, as there is in everything, but that key, that first little key of understanding can open up an entirely different world as to what the ancient peoples were actually experiencing. So myth, a long way of going around answering that question, but that's where I come to the conclusion that particularly origin myths are in fact the recorded accounts of actual catastrophic events of an interplanetary nature in the past. Yeah. And yes, I also argue that these myths have been distorted over time into what we call the occult, and in fact also into a lot of modern day world religions. These distortions are here with us, but if you take that same key that I was talking about, it helps people understand those problems that we have. Why things seem to be so out of whack, why some people, and without trying to leap too far into it, why some people, even to the modern age, are happy sacrificing children in blood rituals. It's because they've lost that key to what mythology was, a record of events as a warning to future generations.
Mm-hmm. So what I also find striking is we find all over the world similar stories, meaning you will find this flood story all over the world. Yep. With a little bit different, but mm-hmm. Let's say the essence of the story is the same. Yeah. Another thing is in Mesopotamia, we have this story about the 7 sages. In India, they appear as the 7 rishis. And then on Easter Island, we have the 7 initiates. So something is going on there. What exactly, I don't know. But how does that happen, that cultures that allegedly had no contact with each other have the
Why
same
the number
flow?
7? Yeah, the common denominator there. I'll add to that, Atlantis had 7 concentric circles in its construction, and so on. We've got 7 days of the week. Why did we settle on 7? Why not 8? Why not 6? Whatever. Why is it 6 days and 1 day of rest in the biblical creation myth? In terms of that. That, according to Saturn theory, is just simply based on the creation of the rings around Saturn. We talk about how in the modern day, when we're talking about people creating mythologies that become distorted, Lord of the Rings, is really effectively a story based on Saturnian myths in terms of, that Lord of the Rings. Saturn had been the planet most famous with its famous rings. And these rings seem to have, there were basically 7 demarcations of rings that surrounded the face of Saturn, according to the perspective of people on Earth. And of course, these rings, with the illumination of the sun, the planet Saturn itself would have cast a shadow across the rings, creating a crescent in those rings. That crescent then revolves around the face of Saturn in a very regular way, because of the Earth's rotation and the person looking from wherever they are up on Earth as the Earth turned. And of course, we know that that's what sort of helped bring about the concept of calculating the passage of time. And that's 7 concentric rings that make up a lot of what those examples of 7 initiates, all this sort of thing. But in Egyptian mythology, we talk about the boat of heaven that travels around and does its its circling. All of this seems to be related to the number 7 being associated with Saturn's rings. It's still an area of quite a lot of study for myself. I'm still getting to a lot of the understanding behind the rings. So, to put that in context, my understanding, I haven't fully studied it, but at one point, the Earth had rings, according to mythology. And so, Earth had its own rings. Now, when you understand that idea of these rings sort of enclosing what is the abode of the gods, this brings into stark relief things like the stone circles of Europe and even North America that you have. Stonehenge in Great Britain being probably the most famous example of it. This is ancient people attempting to put on Earth what they're seeing in the abode of the gods up in the northern, the stationary celestial north. And so they create a monument that has concentric rings, in this case in stone. And of course, we also know that they had a lot of wooden posts they had a lot of wooden posts in Stonehenge when it was originally being used. And it's my contention that Stonehenge is a reflection of what was seen in the celestial north, the Lord of the Rings, Saturn with its rings, but it was a reflection on earth and stone that also took into account this star that rose in the east and set in the west that was getting larger and more important. So they could track that literally in the way that Saturn would have been tracking. Do you know what I mean? By being in the center of Stonehenge, you're looking with the same eyes that Saturn has at the world and this new star that is getting larger, that rotates around the world and causes day and night and so on. So these have observational characteristics, but they're largely they're inspired by this idea that we even find in Islam and Christianity, and that is the kingdom of God on earth. All right. So the Saturn configuration of planets that created the abode of gods of mythology that is supposedly mythology tells us is up there in the celestial north, sitting in a static position. A lot of our temples reflect that here on Earth, while also taking into account this new sun, while also acting as a way of measuring the bounds of creation. This is one of the great leaps forward that you get with the Saturn myth, that by the calculation of time, you also get the idea of weights and measurements. And from these weights and measurements, you can literally measure the boundaries of creation and so on. So civilization flourishes. And in my book, of course, I say it all comes undone when scarcity is introduced to the world once Saturn is knocked from its position and Earth enters into its relationship with the sun. We now have a problem of scarcity. But prior to that, where you didn't have to worry about where your food was coming from, it was all about exploration of this incredible new environment that had been in a shroud of darkness, a semi-nocturnal existence prior to Saturn's bursting forth as a, in a nova-like way. So yeah, it's the reflection of the kingdom of God, or the Lord of the Rings on Earth, can be seen in the temples, let alone in our mythologies, in terms of what we're discussing here.
Mm. So let me see if I have this straight. These the number 7, that is about the 7 rings of Saturn.
Yes. So as far as I understand it, Saturn, during what I call the purple dawn of creation, that period before Saturn burst forth and that let there be light moment when the golden age was launched, Saturn's just a stationary pale disk, like the sun is, but the difference being it's a stationary pale disk in what turns out to be the north celestial regions. When it bursts forth, as we discussed in other interviews and such, because we believe it was a brown dwarf at that time, brown dwarfs are copious carriers of water. A lot of water was ejected. The vast majority of that water went out as a cloud into space, but a lot of water also was captured and then started to settle into orbit. And as it started to settle into orbit, a layering effect, if you can call it that, started to happen between each ring as it got, as more and more vapor, crystallized vapor, ice vapor, settled around Saturn. This it would create one ring joined by a second, joined by a third, and 7 seems to be the number that is associated with that. I was going to say that ultimately, you've seen the hedge mazes in like European gardens, where they have these gardens where hedges are created in a circular maze that people can go into and so on like that. These are all derived from the maze of entering into the abode of the gods. It's the labyrinth of mythology that the Minotaur, the horned god, is at the begin, at the center of. It can be a very frightening thing. You're entering into this maze of rings and concentric circles and things like that. And all manner of things can happen, both good and bad to you. This is why the labyrinth and the Minotaur myth of Greek thing has become symbolic for people, that it's really a story about life. We go through the labyrinth of life trying to avoid violence to us, but at any turn we take, we can be confronted by unforeseen events that can can result in our murder, result in our deaths, and so on. But this has its origins in this idea that trying to understand what was going on in the heavens, this God that burst into light, threw all this water out, this water, they didn't know that at the time. They just see the stuff forming. We know that the rings of Saturn are made of crystallized ice, that they're water. There's so much water in the rings of Saturn that this world, if all that water was brought down, we would have no dry land. You've got the ice moons around Saturn, around Jupiter, that all point to their their brown dwarf star origins. But when these rings are forming, and you've got to be careful that when you look at the Golden Age, it changes in terms of people's ability to calculate time. And this is a wonderful gift. But it doesn't mean that the environment is idyllic. In fact, life under a brown dwarf is very unpredictable. There's all kinds of things that can happen and did happen according to mythology. In fact, the worst crisis of survival takes place at the end of the Golden Age, when Earth is literally severed from its relationship with Saturn, according to mythology. And, the god Zeus takes over, and then ultimately the sun is, part of, the main star in the sky and such. So during that Golden Age, with all this unpredictable nature with Saturn, it's like a maze for people to try and work out. It's like this, sort of trying to figure out what's going on. In Germany, where you're from, they discovered a lot of these conical hats. All right, there's these strange designs that nobody can really work out. You've got two variations. You've got the sticks with the holes at the end, and they have these strange pattern designs up the length of the stick. It looks like a giant needle with an eye at the end. And you also got these conical hats made out of beaten metal that have these, strange, almost psychedelic patterns put on them and so on. That is another reference to trying to understand the rings surrounding the god of the abodes that is connected to Earth by this stairway to heaven, this Birkeland current that goes up. So when people look at these conical hats, they often put them down like you would a witch's hat, the brim at the bottom. To be perfectly honest, the way to look at, no, say perfectly honest, to understand my viewpoint of it, the way to look at these conical hats is to turn them upside down, the brim at the top with the point at the bottom, and then look at it. It becomes a map of what you're seeing in the north skies. And it becomes so important because of all of this cataclysmic activity related to Saturn forming its rings in that Golden Age time. It becomes the utmost importance for humans to watch and observe what's going on, to note any changes that might be taking place. So the ancient Germans, with their fairly advanced work in metal, that kind of material and so on, okay, I can see a situation very much like Stonehenge in Britain. And Germany has its own henges and such like that, but they uniquely have this hat that I don't think has ever really been seen anywhere else and such. Right? They have this hat, and as I say, it's really a funnel with the top, thing, and because of the way metal works and the way that their tools worked, they could record changes in what was going on. All right, and so on. Now, it's not a calendar, it's a record of events. And it's kind of like, well, when we recorded this, there was a disaster. So later on, if you get something similar, oh my God, we're going to see another disaster, something's shaping up. So it's a way of tracking what is happening with these star bodies, these planetary bodies in space that Aristotle said were stars, these gods. It's a way of tracking what the next move is going to be and what you might be able to do in anticipation of that. It's a survival mechanism.
So what I mentioned before with the 7 rishis, initiates, and sages, it has a connotation of, teacher almost. Is there a possibility that the ancients thought that Saturn is a type of teacher and
bringer of laws?
Okay.
Yeah, he's the rule maker. That song, Alan Parsons Project, late 1980s, I think, or early 90s and such. He probably the most Saturnian work of modern pop music that I have ever encountered. I'm the maker of rules, eye in the sky. It's it's that, if you look at the lyrics to it, without realizing it, he's giving you the whole idea of what Saturn is. He is the maker of rules. But, and this is where you get into the distortions of the occult at the later times and so on, that rule maker is capricious enough to sometimes go to hell with all the rules I've made, and everything gets destroyed. And so on, okay? And that's why we have this yearning for the time when it was great under Saturn, when the rules all worked, when the measurements worked and so on. And we had all this, this not renaissance, because it never happened before, this outpouring of civilization. People were mapping the earth, understanding what they were seeing. They were able to map the constellations and the precision of the, precession of the equinox, and all these sorts of things were happening. This is phenomenal time of intellectual advance and understanding, and then it all gets wiped out. It all goes crazy. It's my belief that the pyramid, which is the most precisely celestially north-oriented building on the planet, and that more so than the observatory at Greenwich in London, and such, no other building has been as precisely aligned with celestial north like the Great Pyramid. And it has its aspect of Saturn worship, or the worship of Ra. We can get into that whole confusion about Ra with the sun and Ra with as a Saturn archetype, because that's what we're talking about, this confusion of uniformitarian thinking. But the pyramid, it is my understanding that the pyramid was also a way of preserving weights and measures from the golden age. So it's mathematical precision and all that sort of thing. It was a way of setting in stone a bunch of weights and measures through which civilization could thrive. So if you were, as simple as this, the average person is in a business dispute with another guy, all right, and they're arguing over, you said you would give me such and such amount of water, but you only gave me this. And the other guy says, yes, that's what you ordered. The pyramid is the ultimate decider as to, in those days, as to who has the right measure. All right. I mean, the French have tried to do this with their metrics. They have a kilo of metal. I think it's platinum or something like that. That's the official weight of a kilo. Everything is measured according to that. You have to conform. You have to calibrate with that kilo. The same, they've got a measure for a meter and such, all right? And the pyramid served as the same, practical purpose for people who were looking to say, well, if we're going to have a business agreement, if we're going to trade together, these are the weights and measures that we have to conform to. When I say to you a certain weight, you need to know what that weight is, and I need to know what your weight is, what your measurement is. And I think that was the pyramid's great function on a practical level, rather than some egotistical monument to the self of some pharaoh, probably a reason why they were quite willing to build such a monumental, monolith as the pyramid. The pyramid is mentioned in the Bible as that witness to God at the center of Egypt and so on. There was a sort of attempt by people. Piazzi Smith, the royal astronomer, tried to link it into the British imperial inch, the workings and so on like that, to do. And you had pyramidology, David Davidson, these kinds of guys, who not only saw it as a record of measurements used, accurate measurements, but actually saw it as a calendar of prophecy, if you can imagine. That it mapped out prophetical events. And it seems to me as well that, they were onto something, not so much in the prophecy side of things, but what they seemed to also find was this wonderful connection to the zodiac in terms of the pyramid, in terms of these linear advancements, into the future. And, we've learned in the modern age that the ancients seem to have this incredible understanding of this. It's about 26,000 years where the zodiac sort of does its circuit and such, because of precessional wobble and such, and that. That was a big thing 20, 30 years ago. People were talking, how did they know this? How did they map it out? That's something that can actually be done retroactively, or you can extrapolate. Once you've got, you know, a decade's worth of data, you can say, well, if it carries on like this, this is how it's going to go. But it's all linked in with these, with the pyramid and that measurement sort of thing. That's probably where the Sphinx is the connection between the zodiacal, which is equatorial in nature, because the Sphinx looks to the west where the sun rises, and it looks to where the earth moves in, you know, sort of falls.
No, the sun rises east.
Yeah, sorry. Well, yeah, sorry. The Sphinx looks east.
Yeah.
To the you know, to the horizon where the sun rises, and you know, if you look at a Sphinx in terms of the zodiac, a lot of people like to say it's a pharaoh's head on a lion's body. Some people say it's a woman's head on a lion's body. I'm of the opinion it is a woman's head on a lion's body, and it's the key to how they've read the zodiac. And that is, you start with Virgo, the Virgin, the woman's head, and you end with Leo, the lion's body. And when you read the zodiac that way, and you particularly look at the names of the stars, the Arabic is the best preservation of these names that go back into ancient times. You get a very interesting map of, you know, how people thought the world would evolve, and you know, this resurrectionist idea that becomes Christianity, that was definitely a part of the Egyptian culture with all their mummification of the dead and so on like that. That does seem to be the pyramid's function, along with the Sphinx and along with the zodiac. And the key is an understanding that the pyramid is actually a celestially north aligned monument, with all of its passages and everything aligned with celestial north, and is in fact not only a record of measurements, but done in such a way as a pyramid to reflect the stairway to heaven, that beam of light that connected Earth and Saturn at the time. That was a Birkeland current. Mm-hmm. You know, the ladder to heaven, Jacob's ladder from the Bible. This, you know, what the Aboriginals in Australia referred to as that ladder of spears that connect, you know, head to end in succession, that lead up to the abode of the gods.
Yeah. We also have a story of two brothers that mm-hmm. brought the moon here. Mm-hmm. And when they brought the moon here, the golden age ended and disrupted mm-hmm. something. So we find it with the Zulus, but other cultures have that story as well. It's usually two brothers. And some are speculating if that has been Enki and Enlil.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, Romulus and Remus as well, with the Roman sort of situation, that kind of thing. I haven't heard that particular one. I'll get a reference from you afterwards to go and look into that. But that kind of confirms, in Saturn Death Cults, you know, I put forward the idea that much of what people thought was moon worship in ancient times was actually the crescent of Saturn's rings that they saw. So there's a misidentification there. But how do we explain the moon? All right, because if they were worshiping the crescent, or if part of their deities was represented by the crescent of Saturn and so on, where is the moon in all this? The silver object, and you know, we've got lunar calendars and so on like that. I argue in Saturn Death Cult that the moon is a captured body, that the Earth's captured body, and that its crater formations and so on are a result of absolutely stupendous electrical interaction with the Earth and so on, where the moon being a smaller body would have been absolutely zapped by all kinds of electrical activity to create those stereotypical hexagon-like craters. If you look closely at the moon, look very closely, you will see the hexagons in those near perfect craters. They are not impact craters. Impact craters, the vast majority, 90% plus, would be elongated if it was purely impact, because you've got to be hitting at a 90-degree angle to create a perfect round hole and so on, all right? And then you've got the problem of craters on top of craters. Both are formed perfectly. That only happens when you have electrical strikes, lightning strikes, thunderbolt strikes, and so on. This has all been shown in laboratories at a very small level. You get the moon effect through great electrical discharge activity, and we see that in the moon. People say that the moon is our record of how old the solar system is, because no one has seen a moon impact in human history. All right. Mm-hmm. No, there's no record of, we looked up at the moon and something hit it, and it was a big explosion on the moon, but it's absolutely pockmarked with these so-called impact craters. It's more likely that in its capture process, sometime after Saturn, in the chaos of Saturn's demise, this doomsday event, and so on, that's when the moon was captured. And I would say that the moon may have been native to the solar system prior to the arrival of Saturn, and so on. But you see the same thing on some of the ice moons of Jupiter, where there was a lot of electrical activity there, and the same on Saturn, and so on. So yeah, the moon is a latecomer to the whatever its purpose is. It's a very recent addition to this planet in terms of what mythology tells us, and it becomes associated with moon gods and stuff like that over time. But if you take the biblical account of creation, it's not till the fourth day that the moon and the stars are actually referenced. Yet let there be light would seem to indicate that these things should have been around at the beginning in the first day, and so on. So, there is this lag time for the arrival of the moon and the understanding of the stars and what they were, compared to this bursting forth of light that created the environment of the golden age. Yeah, so the moon is a captured item, in my opinion, and I think mythology tells it. And what you've just told me, yeah, right, seems to back that up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for that. That concludes our first hour, the public hour. And in the second hour, we will continue our conversation and we'll go a little bit deeper into some subjects. Until next time, and we will see the patrons on the other side.